For 25 years, she took her pills on trust and routine. Then one quiet moment forced her to look closer. What she discovered was not fear or illness, but something deeper about control, memory, and the dignity of choosing how to live the rest of her life. She did not remember the first day she began taking medication regularly. That part of her life did not arrive with a ceremony or a clear turning point. It entered quietly, like many things do when people reach their later years. One prescription became two, then three, spaced carefully through the day, folded into meals, mornings, and evenings until they no longer felt like decisions at all. They became habits, and habits, when repeated long enough, begin to feel like truth. For a long time, the bottles sat in the same place. The labels changed colors now and then. The names shifted slightly. The instructions were read once, perhaps twice, then trusted. She believed in the system that had given them to her. She believed in the voices that spoke kindly and confidently across desks and counters. She believed because belief made life simpler, and simplicity has its own kind of comfort when the years start to feel heavy. Trust, for her, was never careless. It was learned. She grew up in a time when authority figures were not questioned easily, especially not doctors. If someone wore a white coat, you listened. If instructions were given, you followed them. That respect was not weakness. It was how people survived, how communities functioned, how order was maintained in a world that often felt unpredictable. Over time, medications blended into the background of her days the same way clocks do. You notice them only when they stop working. She didn't wake up thinking about them. She didn't go to bed wondering why she took them. They simply were part of the furniture of her life, as ordinary as brushing her teeth or locking the door before sleep. There was also relief in that routine. Relief in not having to reconsider decisions already made. At a certain point in life, energy becomes precious. You save it for what truly matters. Family conversations, quiet afternoons, remembering names, keeping balance, both literal and emotional. Reopening old questions can feel exhausting, and so they remain closed, not out of denial, but out of self-preservation. Years passed this way, 25 of them, long enough for seasons to blur together, long enough for small adjustments to feel insignificant, long enough for curiosity to slowly step aside and let familiarity take over. The bottles were refilled, appointments were attended, advice was followed. Everything looked fine from the outside. Yet beneath that calm surface lived a quiet surrender that many never name. When routines are followed without reflection, something subtle happens. Responsibility shifts. Decisions move away from the individual and settle into systems, schedules, and assumptions. This is not a failure of character. It is a human response to complexity. When life becomes layered, we simplify where we can. She had simplified this part of her life completely. At first, that simplification felt like freedom. Less to worry about, less to manage, less to question. But over the years, it also became something else. It became distance. Distance from understanding. Distance from choice. Distance from the sense that she was actively participating in her own care rather than simply receiving it. She didn't notice that shift when it happened. Most people don't. It happens slowly, without pain or alarm. One day blends into the next. You trust because trust has always worked before. You continue because stopping feels unnecessary. There were moments, of course, when a small question would surface. A fleeting thought while standing at the kitchen counter, pill in hand. Do I still need this one? Is this the same as before? But the thought would fade as quickly as it came. There was breakfast to finish. The phone might ring. Life moved on. The world around her changed during those years. Technology advanced. Language shifted. Healthcare systems grew more complex. But her routine stayed steady, like an anchor. Stability can feel like safety, especially when so much else feels uncertain. And yet, stability without awareness has a quiet cost. It narrows attention. It teaches us not to look too closely, not because we are afraid of what we might see, but because we believe there is nothing new to learn. Her trust was sincere. It was earned over decades of being told, gently and repeatedly, that everything was under control, that someone else was watching the details, that she could rest. Rest, however, is different from disengagement, and somewhere along the way, the line between the two had blurred. She did not see herself as passive. She was capable, thoughtful, and independent in many areas of her life. She managed her home. She maintained relationships. She remembered birthdays and stories and small acts of kindness. But in this one area, she had stepped back without fully realizing it. The habit was strong. Habits built over decades do not announce themselves as habits. They feel like common sense. They feel like normalcy. They feel earned. There is also something deeply human about wanting to believe that the systems we rely on are working perfectly. Questioning them can feel like inviting chaos, and for someone who had spent a lifetime holding things together, chaos was not something she welcomed, so she trusted. She continued. She moved forward day after day, year after year, carrying these small objects with her without examining their weight. This chapter of her life was not defined by neglect or ignorance. It was defined by faith in continuity, by the belief that what had worked yesterday would work tomorrow. That belief carried her far. It allowed her to live without constant vigilance. It allowed her to focus on living, not monitoring. But time has a way of changing the meaning of habits. What begins as support can slowly become background noise. And background noise, while easy to ignore, shapes the atmosphere of a life more than we realize. She did not yet know that this quiet trust, built carefully and honestly over 25 years, would eventually be interrupted, not by fear, not by illness, but by something much softer and far more powerful. Awareness. The moment did not arrive with urgency. There was no alarm, no sudden pain, no voice telling her that something was wrong. It arrived quietly, almost politely, as many meaningful moments do. It slipped into her day, unnoticed at first, disguised as something ordinary, something she might have dismissed on any other morning. She was standing in her kitchen, the light from the window softer than it used to be, or perhaps her eyes were simply more aware of shadows now. The familiar bottles were lined up near the sink, their shapes unchanged, their labels facing outward as they always had. She reached for them automatically, the way one reaches for keys when leaving the house, without thinking about the action itself. But this time, something slowed her hand. It wasn't confusion. She knew exactly which bottle came first. It wasn't forgetfulness either. She remembered the routine perfectly. What stalked her was a pause she could not immediately explain, a sense of distance as if she were watching herself from just outside the moment. She picked up one bottle and turned it slightly, noticing the fine print in a way she hadn't before. The letters seemed smaller than she remembered, or maybe she had simply never looked closely enough to notice. She squinted, adjusted her glasses, and read the name again. It was familiar, yet strangely distant, like a word spoken so often it loses its meaning. She felt no fear, no rush of concern, just a quiet curiosity that surprised her. Why had she never really read this before? That question did not accuse her. It did not demand answers. It simply hovered, gentle but persistent, like a breeze that makes you aware of the air around you for the first time in a while. She set the bottle down and looked at the others. They stood there patiently, as they always had, waiting to be taken, waiting to continue their role in her life. and for the first time in years, she did not reach for the next one right away. This pause was unfamiliar territory. Her life had been shaped by continuity, by doing what needed to be done without hesitation. Pausing, especially without a clear reason, felt almost indulgent, but something inside her allowed it. She leaned against the counter and took a breath. The house was quiet. No one was waiting for her. There was no schedule pressing in. Time, for once, felt wide enough to hold a question. She thought about how often change is portrayed as dramatic. We expect it to arrive with signs and warnings, with urgency that forces our attention. But real change, the kind that reshapes how we see ourselves, often begins much more softly. It begins with noticing. The noticing, she realized, had been building for a while. There had been small moments over the past year that she hadn't connected until now. Occasions when she felt slightly less present than she wanted to be. Times when she lost a word mid-sentence or struggled to recall why she had walked into a room. Nothing alarming, nothing unusual for someone her age, but noticeable especially to someone who had always prided herself on clarity and awareness. She had dismissed those moments gently, as most people do. Aging comes with changes, and she had accepted that with grace. She did not expect perfection from herself. But standing there now, she wondered whether acceptance had quietly turned into assumption. The pause deepened. She realized that she had spent years responding to life rather than reflecting on it, doing what was asked, following what was advised. And while that had served her well, it had also left little room for reevaluation, for asking whether what once made sense still did. This realization did not come with regret. It came with recognition. She remembered a conversation from months earlier, one she had barely thought about at the time. A friend around her age had mentioned feeling clearer after making small adjustments to her daily routines. Not dramatic changes, just paying closer attention. At the time, she had nodded politely and moved on. Everyone has stories. Everyone has theories. Now that memory returned with new weight. She also remembered moments of quiet frustration she hadn't named, feeling tired in ways that didn't quite match her activities, feeling slightly detached during conversations she cared about. Again, nothing extreme, just enough to be felt, not enough to be feared. Standing there, she understood something important. This moment was not about suspicion or blame. It was about awareness reclaiming space in her life. She picked up the bottle again, this time with intention. She read the label slowly, not just the name, but the instructions, the timing, the purpose as she understood it. She noticed how much had changed since the first time it had been prescribed, how different her life was now, how different she was. That thought stayed with her. She was not the same person she had been 25 years ago. Her body had changed, her priorities had shifted, her understanding of herself had deepened. Yet this part of her life had remained frozen in time, continuing on momentum alone. The interruption of routine felt almost like an invitation. She did not feel compelled to act immediately. There was no sense of urgency pushing her toward decisions. What she felt instead was permission. Permission to pause. Permission to look. Permission to wonder. This was new, and it felt strangely comforting. She realized how rarely she allowed herself moments like this. Moments without productivity or purpose, moments dedicated simply to understanding. Life had taught her to be efficient, to move forward, to trust systems designed to help her. But now efficiency gave way to curiosity. She sat down at the table with the bottles laid out in front of her. The morning light shifted as time passed, but she did not notice. She was focused inward, listening to a part of herself that had been quiet for a long time. The interruption was not a rebellion against routine. It was a conversation with it. She thought about how easily routines can outlive their usefulness, not because they become harmful, but because they no longer reflect who we are. They continue simply because stopping them feels harder than continuing. In that moment, she saw her routine clearly for the first time in decades, not as a lifeline or a burden, but as a set of choices made long ago, still shaping her days. She felt a calm resolve forming, not to change everything, but to understand it. Understanding felt like the right next step, not action, not judgment, just clarity. The interruption had done its work. It had shifted her from automatic living into conscious awareness. And once awareness enters, it rarely leaves quietly. She gathered the bottles back together, not with dismissal, but with respect. They had played a role in her life. They had supported her through years of change, but now they were asking something in return. Attention. As she stood up from the table, she felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just more present. As if she had stepped back into a part of herself that had been waiting patiently. She did not know yet where this pause would lead. She did not know what she would find when she looked more closely, but she sensed that something important had already shifted. Routine had been interrupted, not by force, but by awareness. And awareness, once awakened, has a way of guiding us forward gently, honestly, and at our own pace. That morning ended much like any other. She went about her day. She made her calls. She prepared her meals. Life continued, but something had changed beneath the surface. The pause stayed with her, and soon she would act on it, not out of fear, but out of respect for herself and the life she was still actively living. She did not rush into the next step. The pause she had allowed herself needed time to settle, like sediment drifting slowly to the bottom of clear water. For a few days she carried the awareness quietly, letting it accompany her through ordinary moments. She noticed how often she reached for familiarity without reflection, how easily habits resumed their place once attention wandered. But the pause had changed her relationship with those habits. They no longer felt invisible. One afternoon, when the house was still and the light had softened into late-day calm, she sat down at the table again. This time she brought more than just the bottles. She brought her reading glasses, a notepad, and a sense of patience she had learned over a lifetime of waiting for things that mattered. She lined the bottles up carefully, not out of anxiety, but out of respect. Each one represented a chapter of her past, a time when a decision had been made for a reason that once felt clear and necessary. She understood that revisiting those decisions did not mean rejecting them. It meant acknowledging that time had passed. She picked up the first bottle and read every word, slowly, without skipping, without assuming she already knew what it said. The name, the dosage, the timing. Words she had glanced at for years now received her full attention. She noticed how technical language can feel strangely impersonal when read closely, as if it belongs to no one in particular. She felt a flicker of emotion she had not expected, not fear, but humility. The realization that she had entrusted so much of her daily life to things she barely remembered choosing. That realization did not shame her. It softened her. She moved on to the next bottle, then the next. With each one, memory surfaced. A doctor's office long ago, a conversation that felt rushed, a period in her life when energy was scarce and help was welcome. Each bottle carried a story, and she was finally listening. There was something grounding about reading without judgment. She did not accuse herself of negligence. She did not blame the past for doing what it thought was best. She approached the process the way one approaches old photographs, with curiosity, tenderness, and an understanding that people do the best they can with what they know at the time. As she read, she noticed how her body responded, not with alarm, but with recognition. She became aware of how sensitive she had grown to subtle changes, how deeply she valued clarity now, how much she treasured mornings when her thoughts felt sharp and her presence felt intact. She realized that what she was doing went beyond reviewing information. She was reclaiming authorship over her own story. For years she had accepted summaries, explanations offered briefly, then trusted indefinitely. Now she wanted the full sentences, the context, the meaning behind the names. She was not seeking certainty. She was seeking understanding. Time passed quietly as she read. The notepad remained mostly blank. She wasn't there to make lists or decisions. She was there to witness, to see her life choices as they truly were, not as they had been simplified over time. At moments, she paused to sit with what she felt, a mixture of gratitude and distance. Gratitude for the care she had received, distance from the person she had been when those decisions were made. That distance felt natural. People change, lives evolve, needs shift. She thought about how rarely people are encouraged to revisit old decisions with kindness. So often, reflection is framed as regret or correction. But what she felt was neither. It was presence. Looking closely required a certain emotional steadiness. It meant resisting the urge to rush toward conclusions. It meant allowing questions to exist without immediate answers. That patience had come with age, and she used it well. She noticed something else, too. As she read, she felt more grounded in her body, more aware of how she moved through space, more attuned to her internal rhythms. It was as if attention itself had a calming effect, reminding her that she was still capable of learning, still capable of engaging deeply with her own life. There were moments when the language felt dense, when the information seemed distant from her lived experience. She allowed herself to acknowledge that complexity without feeling overwhelmed. Not everything needs to be fully understood to be respected. Sometimes understanding begins simply by paying attention. She set one bottle aside and rested her hands on the table. She looked around the room. The familiar furniture, the quiet corners. This was her life, not abstract, not theoretical, and these small objects were part of it, whether she examined them or not. She realized then how powerful it was to slow down enough to truly see what we carry. We often move forward without checking our load, trusting that it remains manageable because it always has been. But checking does not mean we plan to discard. It means we acknowledge weight. This process did not make her anxious. It made her feel steady, honest. She felt more like herself than she had in a long time. Not younger, not stronger, just present. She gathered the bottles again, this time with a new sense of relationship. They were no longer silent companions. They were known, seen, placed back into her routine with awareness rather than assumption. That evening, as she prepared for bed, she noticed how her mind felt quieter. Not because answers had been found, but because questions had been welcomed. There is a certain peace that comes from allowing oneself to look closely without rushing to fix anything. She laid down and thought about how many areas of life remain untouched simply because they have always been there. How many decisions rest on autopilot long after their original context has faded. Aging, she realized, offers a rare opportunity not to simplify life further, but to engage with it more deliberately. This was not about control. It was about connection. Connection to her past self, to her present needs, and to the future she still cared deeply about shaping. Looking closely for the first time did not change her life overnight. It changed her posture within it. She stood a little more upright internally. She felt less like a passenger and more like a participant. She slept deeply that night, and when she woke the next morning, The question that had begun quietly in her kitchen had evolved. It was no longer just about what she was taking. It was about why she wanted to know. That answer would take a little more time to surface, but she was ready to listen. The answer did not arrive all at once. It did not present itself as a clear sentence or a single realization. Instead, it formed slowly, shaped by quiet moments and subtle shifts in how she experienced her days. As she moved through her routine with renewed awareness, she began to notice not just what she was doing, but how she felt while doing it. She paid attention to her mornings, the way her thoughts came together as she made coffee, the ease or difficulty of following a conversation on the radio, the small pauses between thoughts that had once gone unnoticed. These were not problems to solve. They were signals, gentle and informative, asking to be acknowledged. For a long time, she had believed that growing older meant accepting a gradual narrowing of experience, a little less energy, a little less sharpness, a little less certainty. She had accepted this not with bitterness, but with grace. Life had given her many good years, and she did not expect perfection from the ones that followed. But what she was beginning to understand now was that acceptance did not have to mean disengagement. The real reason she needed to know more about her medications was not rooted in fear of illness or worry about consequences. It was rooted in her desire to remain present in her own life, to feel connected to her thoughts, her memories, her conversations, to recognize herself in the mirror, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Independence had always mattered to her, though she had rarely spoken about it directly. It lived in small choices. Choosing when to go out and when to stay in. Choosing what to cook, what to read, when to rest. These choices formed the quiet structure of her dignity. Over time, she had noticed that some choices felt slightly less clear than they used to. Not gone, just softened. She could still decide, still act, still manage, but the sharpness she valued felt dulled at the edges. She had told herself this was natural, and perhaps some of it was, but now she wondered whether all of it had to be. This wondering did not come with suspicion. It came with care. She thought about memory, not as something dramatic that disappears overnight, but as something delicate that requires attention. Memory connects us to our stories, our relationships, our sense of continuity. When memory feels fragile, even in small ways, it can quietly unsettle a person's sense of self. She wanted to protect that connection, not by fighting time, but by understanding what might influence how she experienced it. As she reflected, she realized that reviewing her medications was one of the few areas where she could gently reclaim clarity without forcing change. It was an act of respect toward herself, not an attempt to control outcomes. She had spent years caring for others, listening closely, adjusting when needed. Now she was turning that same attentiveness inward. There was also something else, deeper and more personal, a desire to feel like her life was still hers to shape, that decisions were not simply inherited from the past and carried forward indefinitely, that she was still allowed to ask questions even if the answers led to no immediate changes. As people age, conversations often shift around them. Others begin to speak more, decide more, explain more, explain more. This can be helpful, even necessary at times, but it can also slowly erode a person's sense of agency. She had felt that erosion in subtle ways, moments when she nodded along rather than engaging fully. Looking closely at her medications became a way of stepping back into that engagement. She noticed how empowering it felt simply to know, to recognize names, to understand purposes, to feel informed rather than passive. This knowledge did not burden her, it steadied her. She also realized that her need to know was about trust, not blind trust, but informed trust, trust that included her own judgment alongside the expertise of others. trust that allowed for conversation rather than silence. This shift changed how she carried herself. She spoke more deliberately. She asked more thoughtful questions in other areas of her life, too. Not challenging, not demanding, just present. She felt more connected to her body as well, more aware of how she responded to rest, to stimulation, to quiet. This awareness did not make her anxious. It made her compassionate toward herself. Aging was no longer something happening to her. It was something she was living through consciously. The real reason she needed to know, she realized, was simple and profound. She wanted to remain herself for as long as possible. Not the version of herself from decades ago, but the self she was becoming now. Attentive, reflective, grounded. She wanted to continue recognizing her own voice when she spoke, to follow her own thoughts without strain, to feel anchored in conversations, memories, in choices. These things mattered more to her than convenience or habit. Understanding her medications was not about changing the past. It was about honoring the present. By allowing herself to look closely, she had opened a door to deeper self-respect. She was no longer moving through this part of her life on momentum alone. She was walking with intention. And in that intention, she found peace. This realization did not demand action. It did not insist on immediate decisions. It simply clarified her purpose. Knowing why she needed to know was enough for now. She carried that clarity with her quietly. Like a steady light, it informed how she moved, how she listened, how she rested. It reminded her that even in later years, reflection is not only possible, it is powerful. As this understanding settled, she felt a gentle readiness to share something, even if only through example. Her journey, personal as it was, held meaning beyond her own experience. That meaning would become clear as she considered what her choice might offer others walking similar paths, often without realizing how much awareness could still shape their days. And so, without urgency or expectation, her story began to open outward. She never thought of her experience as a lesson. It did not feel important enough to carry that weight. It was simply something that had happened quietly, privately, without an audience. And yet, as time passed, she began to see how easily others might recognize themselves in her story. Not because they shared the same routines or took the same medications, but because they shared the same way of moving through life. Carefully, respectfully, often without questioning what had been put in place years before. Aging, she realized, does not announce itself with clear boundaries. There is no single moment when one becomes older. It happens gradually, through small accommodations, gentle adjustments, and quiet acceptances. Most of the time, these changes are wise. They help people conserve energy, avoid unnecessary strain, and focus on what truly matters. But sometimes those same accommodations can quietly narrow awareness, not through neglect, but through kindness toward oneself, the desire to avoid complexity, the wish to trust that what has worked before will continue to work. Her choice to look more closely was not about disruption, it was about balance. As she reflected on her experience, she thought about how many people her age carry similar routines without ever revisiting them. How many have learned to accept things as fixed simply because revisiting them feels daunting or unnecessary? There is a shared understanding among older adults that not everything needs to be questioned. Peace often comes from letting some things rest, but peace, she now understood, can also come from gentle attention. Her story offers something simple to the rest of us, not instruction, not warning. Just permission to pause without panic, to look without blame, to ask questions without expecting dramatic answers. There is dignity in paying attention to one's own life, in recognizing that time has passed and that needs may have shifted. This dignity does not depend on independence alone. It depends on presence. She did not change everything after her review. That was never the goal. She continued her routines, but with a new relationship to them. They no longer felt automatic. They felt chosen. Even when the choice was to continue, the act of choosing mattered. For others, her experience becomes a mirror, a quiet invitation to notice what has become invisible through repetition. Not just medications, but habits of thought, patterns of rest, ways of relating to the world. Many seniors carry an unspoken belief that questioning old decisions means admitting they were wrong. Her story gently challenges that belief. Reflection does not rewrite the past, it honors it. It acknowledges the decisions made years ago were made with care, knowledge, and good intentions. Looking again is not rejection, it is respect for the present moment. She also understood something deeper, that maintaining a sense of self in later life requires more than physical independence. It requires mental and emotional engagement, the willingness to stay curious about one's own experience, to remain in conversation with oneself. This engagement does not require energy in the way it once did. It requires honesty, and honesty, she found, becomes easier with age, not harder. Her choice reminds others that they are still allowed to be participants in their own lives, not just recipients of care or advice, but thoughtful individuals capable of reflection. That ability does not fade unless it is surrendered. She thought about friends who had mentioned feeling less like themselves over time, less sharp, less engaged. Often these feelings are dismissed as inevitable. Sometimes they are. But sometimes they are signals asking for attention rather than resignation. Her story does not promise solutions. It offers perspective. There is comfort in knowing that awareness itself can be restorative, that taking time to understand one's routines can bring a sense of calm and clarity, even if nothing changes outwardly. That presence has value independent of outcome. As she continued living with this awareness, she noticed how it spread naturally into other areas of her life. She listened more deeply. She rested more intentionally. She spoke with greater confidence about what she needed and what she did not. None of this made her life louder or more complicated. It made it quieter, more grounded. This is what her choice offers the rest of us, a reminder that later life is not a closing chapter where curiosity must end. It is a chapter where reflection can deepen, where understanding can replace assumption, and where peace can be built on clarity rather than habit alone. Her story does not ask others to follow her steps exactly. It asks only that they notice their own, that they give themselves permission to look closely at what they carry each day, both seen and unseen. There is wisdom in continuity, but there is also wisdom in review. As the years move forward, the balance between the two becomes a personal choice, one that can be made quietly, thoughtfully, and without fear. She continues her days now much as before, the same house, the same light in the mornings, the same routines carried with a lighter grip. Nothing dramatic has changed, and yet everything feels more aligned. She knows why she does what she does, and in that knowing she has found something deeply valuable, not control, not certainty, but peace rooted in awareness. That peace is available to anyone willing to pause long enough to look. And sometimes that is enough.